I love coming up to Sauk. This was the first place I gave a talk as executive director at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. Almost 7 years ago, I was invited to speak here about Thomas Paine, and that was a fun lecture to prepare. I learned a lot, and it was nice to come up here in the winter. It's nicer to come up here on a beautiful fall morning, I gotta say. The last time I spoke here was for a memorial service for my old friend George Shalaby, and I miss George, I miss Peggy. They're with me today. The subject of the talk today is gerrymandering, but before I really get into the heart of that, I want to spend several minutes, if you'll indulge me, talking about where we are as far as our democracy goes in this country and in this state, because there is an anti-democracy movement in this country that we cannot underestimate, that we underestimate at our peril. We almost lost our democracy on January 6th. We can't forget that. We can't ever forget that. And we almost lost our democracy in the lead up to January 6th. It's come out now in the last week or so that Trump had one of his lawyers give Vice President Pence an instruction manual as to how he could just throw out everybody's vote on November 3rd and declare the election null and void and keep Trump in power. This is the closest thing we've ever had to a coup in the United States history. It's that dramatic a departure from the norms and proper functions of a democracy. And on the evening of January 6th, I thought the Trump fever might have broken. But actually, it broke for all of what? 24 hours? Because it came raging right back. I mean, for a second there, common sense and a modicum of courage prevailed when you saw the great speeches from Mitch McConnell, even though he didn't vote for impeachment, but Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham even. But then within 24 to 36 hours, they were all back to defending Donald Trump. And the fever hasn't broke since. It's raging across this country still. And it's a huge threat to our democracy. And it's not just the Trump cult that is a threat to our democracy. White nationalism is a threat to our democracy. And we've seen white nationalism manifest in our streets with heavily armed white males with Confederate flags and Nazi paraphernalia. We saw it in Charlottesville. We've seen it elsewhere. This is unusual for this country. We haven't seen anything like this since pro-Nazi forces gathered in Madison Square Garden in 1940. And on top of that, there is a rash of irrationalism all across this country. The Trump cult is part of the irrationalism. The believing that the election was stolen is part of the irrationalism. The anti-vax stuff is part of the irrationalism. QAnon is part of the irrationalism. You know, it's hard to have a functioning democracy with this level of irrationalism in the country. And then there is this right-wing media ecosystem that feeds this irrationalism. I mean, there are people who are hooked up to Fox News or OAN and Sean Hannity on right-wing radio. They're hooked up like a IV drip 24/7, and that's all they get fed, is this craziness. And that's why we have democracy really in trouble right now. This anti-democracy movement is driving our country over a cliff, and we got to really put the brakes on. We got to put the brakes on nationally. We got to put the brakes on here in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, we see manifestations of this anti-democracy movement. We see it in this ridiculous fishing expedition that Speaker Voss has handed over to Michael Gableman. We see how reckless Gableman is with his so-called investigation, handing out subpoenas, then saying he's not going to enforce the subpoenas right away, then changing his mind that he is going to enforce them. Michael Gableman, who said after the election that the election was stolen by unelected bureaucrats at the Wisconsin Elections Commission. Now he's investigating the Wisconsin Elections Commission and the election itself after he declared with no evidence whatsoever that the thing was stolen. I mean, what kind of a unbiased referee is that? And then he hired this guy named Andrew Kloster. Kloster. Kloster is a former lawyer in the Trump administration. And Kloster said in April that the right wing needs its own irate hooligans. They need their own irate hooligans like the Proud Boys. And then they need corrupt DAs to let their Proud Boys and these hooligans off the hook. This is an incitement to right-wing violence. This is an incitement to corrupt law enforcement. And Closter should be fired. Gableman should be fired. Enough of the Gableman investigation. It's time for Gableman to go. It's time for this fishing expedition to go. And what's behind all this? It's a waste, first of all, of taxpayer money. $676,000 of your money and my money is going for this fishing expedition, which is designed to do what? It's designed, number one, to give Robin Vos some cover from the right-wingers in the legislature, including Janelle Brandon, who he foolishly appointed to head the Wisconsin Assembly Committee on Elections, who also says the election was stolen. You know, there were rallies at the Capitol in Madison a couple Fridays where she was there, Janelle Brandon, and also former Milwaukee County Sheriff Clark was there, and they were yelling, Robin Vos has got to go. And so Vos is feeling the heat from the right-wing base, and then some right-wingers went into the Capitol, into his office, to demand that he sign subpoenas. He has signed subpoenas now. So he's worried about his right flank. That's why he was on that plane with Donald Trump, with those insipid smiles, if you saw them. So that's one reason for Vos, a selfish reason. And you know, our money shouldn't be spent for one individual's selfish purposes, nor should our money be spent for crass partisan purposes. And that's another reason why they're doing these fishing expeditions. They're doing them because they want to keep feeding their right-wing base, because they know those are the folks who come out and vote, especially in primaries. And we saw how a fraction of that base reacts when they're fed that rancid red meat. We saw that on January 6th. So they're inviting another January 6th. And then another reason they're doing it is because it's a prelude. It's a prelude to voter suppression. It's a prelude to these anti-voter bills that they've been trying to pass all across the country and here in Wisconsin to curb our rights and our freedoms to vote. Now, some of the bills that were introduced by the legislature and passed by the legislature would have done unbelievable things. They would have made it, first of all, harder for all of us to vote by absentee ballot. Much more difficult for all of us to vote, and much more difficult for a subset of us to vote. And that subset is people who are disabled and in nursing homes of all places. This is the most ridiculous bill that was introduced. The bill was introduced to say any employee of a nursing home would be committing a felony if that person even asked someone in the nursing home, a resident, whether he or she wanted to register to vote or wanted to vote. It would have been a felony to say, you know, election day is coming up. Are you registered to vote? It would have been a felony to say, election day is coming up. Do you want to request an absentee ballot application? Or election day is here. Do you want to cast a ballot? This is how we're doing it at the nursing home. That would have been a felony. I mean, that's the mindset of these people who are just trying to curb our rights and our freedoms to vote. Fortunately, Governor Evers vetoed every anti-voter bill that landed on his desk, but you can only imagine what would happen if he's not there. And so this anti-democracy movement here in Wisconsin and around the country is really petrifying. The white nationalism, we saw evidence of that in the legislature about 10 days ago when Representative Wickers, Republican in the Assembly, introduced a bill to tell teachers that they cannot talk about sexism and racism in any full way. They can't use words like patriarchy. They can't use words like structural racism. They can't use words like woke. They can't use even the term social justice, if you can believe that. So this was a way to coddle white male fragility, but you can't use white male fragility in school either, I guess, if that were to pass. But that's what we're looking at, this ugly, toxic combination of white nationalism, irrationalism, Trump cult, and the right-wing media infrastructure that fuels it all. And so it's actually the scariest moment in my adult lifetime, watching politics now for the last 45 years. I'm 63. We cannot underestimate the threat that is before us nationally and here in Wisconsin. And we've got to do everything we can nonviolently to oppose this anti-democracy movement. Fortunately, here in Wisconsin, there is a very healthy pro-democracy movement, and that is most clear in this movement to ban gerrymandering. I mean, look at this map over here. 56 counties, there's 72 counties in Wisconsin. 56 of the 72 counties have passed referendums or resolutions urging the legislature to ban gerrymandering. Now, you know and I know that, of course, Sauk has passed both the referendum and the resolution at the county board level. But you know there are not 56 blue counties in the state. There's not 46 blue counties. There's not 36. I don't think there's 26 blue counties. A lot of these counties were red counties as far as Trump goes. But the thing about banning gerrymandering is that it crosses ideological lines. That people, whether they identify as conservative or liberal, Democratic or Republican or independent, they don't want monkey business happening in Madison with the people who are in power. You know, they want basic fair play. We want Wisconsin nice, basic fair play, a level playing field. And gerrymandering allows whichever political party is in power to rig the maps to keep themselves in power for another 10 years, not by convincing anyone that their ideas are better or that more people should vote for them, just by moving lines here and there on a map, which is nuts. And so people get that. And I used to cart around a map like this, which was almost all white 5 years ago. And now look at it, it's almost all purple. So there's been tremendous progress made on this issue. And it's been made because of a lot of work that's been done by a lot of people. Dale Schultz is the former majority leader of the state Senate from Richland Center, and Tim Cullen's the former majority leader of the Senate Dems down from Janesville, where my wife grew up. And they've been going around the state for the last 7 years giving talks about why we've got to ban gerrymandering. They've done a great job in educating people on this. And the Whitford case, this case that was brought by a bunch of Democrats after the gerrymander of 2011, that did a lot to educate people in this state. Now, the Whitford case was upheld, the plaintiffs were upheld in federal court in Madison in 2016. A panel of federal judges ruled that the redistricting, the gerrymandering in 2011, was one of the grossest gerrymanders in modern American history, and declared that it was unconstitutional, that it violated the First Amendment rights to free speech and free association, and the 14th Amendment right to due process of Democrats in this state, because they were, jammed into as few districts as possible. And so that case, which went to the Supreme Court once and then got kicked down for a technicality, did raise attention. I would have thought that the U.S. Supreme Court would have ruled this unconstitutional. Before the Wisconsin case got back to the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court took on 2 other gerrymandering cases. And let me say right now, as clearly as I can, that gerrymandering is wrong whether Democrats are rigging the maps or whether Republicans are rigging the maps. No one should be able to rig the maps and keep themselves in power just by playing around with the maps. And so there was this case, a combined case to the U.S. Supreme Court after ours was sent down on a technicality, that gave the U.S. Supreme Court a perfect opportunity to outlaw hyperpartisan gerrymandering. And one case was from Maryland, where the Democrats had rigged the maps grotesquely. The other case was from North Carolina, where the Republicans had rigged the maps grotesquely. And Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, said, on the one hand, and this is a direct quote, that hyperpartisan gerrymandering is antithetical to our democratic principles. Now, when the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court says something is antithetical to our democratic principles, I would think that the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court would then have an obligation to find a solution to that violation of our democratic principles. But lo and behold, he said something else, and this isn't a direct quote. He said, "Go away, don't ever come back. I don't want to ever see you again anywhere near a federal courthouse door with claims about hyperpartisan gerrymandering." In legalese, he said this is a non-justiciable decision, and it's up to the states to solve the problem. Well, that's kind of a chicken and egg problem. If he's going to send it back to the states, where the states have had the power to gerrymander the maps, how are you going to fix that problem? Well, we've been working on it here. And let's remember what happened in 2011, when the Republicans all of a sudden had total control. Let me go back 2 years. Democrats had total control in 2009, hard as it may be to believe right now. Democrats controlled the state Senate. Democrats controlled the state assembly. We had a Democrat in the governor's chair, Jim Doyle. And actually there was a hearing that was brought by Jeff Smith, who was then in the assembly, about banning gerrymandering. They introduced a bill to ban gerrymandering in 2009. Spencer Black from Madison was a big prime mover behind that. They didn't bring it to a vote, though. The leadership of the Democratic Party in 2009 didn't bring it to a vote. They could have solved the problem then and there. They had the power to solve it. Why didn't they bring it to a vote? They didn't bring it to a vote because political power is the most intoxicating drug there is on the market. Political power made them deluded. They thought they were going to win the elections in 2010 and could then rig the maps for themselves and make the Democratic majority in the state assembly and the state Senate bigger by just moving a line here and there on the map. Well, lo and behold, what happened in 2010? There was a Republican sweep. The Republicans took control of the state Senate. The Republicans flipped the state assembly. And guess who became governor? Scott Walker. Hate to mention his name. And they wasted little time, very little time, in figuring out that they should rig the maps for themselves. They actually flew a guy in from Oklahoma, of all places. A political scientist from the University of Oklahoma came with his software savvy and created 9 maps. He drew the maps not in the Capitol. They didn't do the people's business in the people's house. They scurried across the street into an office in the law offices of Michael Best and Friedrich, a conservative law firm in the Glass Bank in Madison. You know the building. And they drew the maps in a room that became known as the map room. And the map room was a locked map room. You and everybody else in the public wasn't allowed in. The media wasn't allowed in. Democrats weren't allowed into the locked map room. Even Republicans who weren't in leadership weren't allowed into the locked map room unless the two young male aides to the speaker who held the keys to the locked map room let them into the locked map room. And once the Republican legislators were allowed into the locked map room, they could only look at their own redrawn district. And before they could leave the locked map room, they had to sign an oath of secrecy. Now that is not how democracy is supposed to function. Democracy is supposed to function in sunlight, in daylight, in public, not in a locked map room in a private law office where people are sworn to secrecy. People we elect are sworn to secrecy. So that's how it was done last time. They didn't draw just one map in the locked map room. They drew 9 maps, each successive map predicting a greater Republican majority just by shoving more and more Democrats into fewer and fewer districts. That was one technique. And the other technique was to splinter Democrats from cities. So in Marshfield and Sheboygan and in Beloit, for instance, they would take 1/3 of Sheboygan and send it into the northwest and another third into the directly out west and another third southwest, so that Sheboygan wouldn't be represented by a Democrat, and that those Democrats who were in Sheboygan would now be swallowed up by all the rural Republican voters that they were sent into the hinterlands with. Same thing happened in Marshfield. And it was quite clear. That's what they did. And so they took one of these most aggressive maps, rammed it through the legislature in 10 days, and it became law. Now, when the judges, that federal panel in Madison, ruled these maps unconstitutional, they said, no, they said the citizens of Wisconsin have endured unconstitutional maps for too long. No one in Wisconsin should have to endure another election under these unconstitutional maps. That was January 2017. Now where are we? Well, no new maps were drawn. They ordered a redrawing of the maps. The U.S. Supreme Court stayed that decision and then said, forget about any legal claims here in federal court. And so we've had to endure those elections from 2017 when they said we shouldn't have to, up to today. And now the census data came down a couple months ago, and the legislature is drawing its maps again. And Robin Vos has, and Devin Lemieux, who is majority leader in the state Senate, they have published their criteria for redrawing the maps. And one of their primary criteria is, check this out, to keep the old maps as much as possible intact. So they want the maps that we were told by a federal panel of judges in 2017 were unconstitutional and we shouldn't have to endure them for another single election. that now we should endure those till the year 2030? I mean, that is about as outrageous a claim as you can imagine, but that's where they're at. So what's likely to happen here? Governor Evers is going to veto these maps, and then they're going to be decided by the courts. There's one other ingredient I wanted to throw into the mix, which is the People's Maps Commission. Governor Evers did a great job by putting together the People's Maps Commission. He didn't appoint the commissioners. He had retired judges in Wisconsin appoint the commissioners. They held hearings in every congressional district here in Wisconsin. They took expert testimony, they took lay testimony, they took maps from citizens, maybe from some of you who drew maps. They got 800 maps drawn from citizens. They got tremendous amount of input, and they have now drawn 3 different maps that they consider to be fairer maps than the ones that were drawn last time around anyway. And those maps now are an illustration that we can use when the Republicans come up with their rigged maps to say, look, this is a better way, this is a rigged way. They also may be used in court, these maps from the People's Maps Commission, because at some point a judge is going to have to draw the maps, or a judge is going to have to appoint a special master, an expert, to draw the maps. And since the People's Maps Commission has done all this work in gathering testimony and data and drawing maps, they'll have some options to choose from. Of course, they could choose the Voss map. But I think they're going to give us a fairer map this time around, the judges are, than we had in 2011, no matter where it ends up. Now, right now, we're in a crazy situation where there is the same court case, essentially, both in federal court and at the Wisconsin Supreme Court. In federal court, there were 2 cases that were combined. One was from National Democrats. The other is from nonprofit groups like the League of Women Voters in Wisconsin, Black Leaders Organizing in Communities Bloc, and Voces de la Frontera. They are being represented by Law Forward, which is another great new thing that's happened in Wisconsin over the last couple of years. We have this great new law firm called Law Forward that is basically the progressive answer to the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, this group that's been funded by the Bradley Foundation over the last 20 years to file one nasty right-wing lawsuit after another in court. And so Law Forward is pressing that case, and the federal court has combined the Law Forward case and the one from the National Democrats. That's happening in federal court. Now, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty asked the Wisconsin Supreme Court to take what's called original jurisdiction over the redistricting in Wisconsin, which means it doesn't have to go to circuit court, it doesn't have to go to appellate court in this state, it goes straight to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And the conservative majority of the Wisconsin Supreme Court granted that petition for them to take original jurisdiction of it. So we have these 2 cases going on simultaneously. At the moment, the federal district court said, we're going to be on hold here for a while the Wisconsin Supreme Court hears the case for a little bit. But the federal court, in saying that, also insisted that there are real federal issues at play here and that ultimately this should be resolved at the federal court level. Some of those issues are just the basic one person, one vote. Now, what the Law Forward case and the Democrats case said is, look, right now these maps from 2011, which the Republicans want to keep in until 2030, are clearly unconstitutional. There was a famous Supreme Court case back in the 1960s, I think it was the Carr case, that said in redistricting, each district has to have the same number of people in it. Well, right now, that's not true, because the new census data has showed us clearly that some areas like Dane County have gained something like 15% population, 20,000 new people in Dane County. So the districts in Dane County now have many more people in them than a district that has didn't lose any people, or districts that lost people, for instance. So the voices of the people who are shoved into those districts in Dane County now, their voices and votes aren't as loud and don't count as much as the people who are in the districts that stayed the same or lost population. So it's clearly against that Supreme Court precedent of one person, one vote. And so that's one claim that the federal courts are going to have to decide. They're not deciding on hyperpartisanship because Chief Justice Roberts said you can't do that, but they can decide and bring cases on one person, one vote. They can also bring cases on racial discrimination. Actually, the only part of the 2011 horrible rigging of the maps, the only decision that went against Republicans was a decision about racial discrimination against Latinos in the Milwaukee area. They had to redraw 2 districts in Milwaukee because they were disenfranchising Latinos in the way they drew those maps. Similar claims can be made this time with the way they're going to be drawing the maps. So the other thing is, even if it ends up the Wisconsin Supreme Court, it's no longer a slam dunk up there. It's no longer a slam dunk at the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Why? Because number one, they have a slim majority. It used to be 5-2, now it's 4-3, because Joe Karofsky won that race. And also the surprising thing is, there is a Republican or conservative person on the Wisconsin Supreme Court who has some independence and doesn't vote with the conservatives all the time on cases like the election. You know, there were 3 members of the Wisconsin Supreme Court that were perfectly willing to entertain the idea of throwing out tens of thousands of votes that people cast in Wisconsin under the rules that the people of Wisconsin were told were valid at the time that they voted. Not that they were fraudulent votes. They voted, you know, at Democracy in the Park in Madison, for instance, or they voted by Dropbox, for instance. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court, 3 of the justices anyway, were willing to toss those out or hear arguments about tossing all those votes out, legitimately cast votes. Unbelievable. But one of them, Brian Hagedorn, ruled with the liberals on that. And so, you know, it's no longer a guarantee that every time Robin Voss or Rick Essenberg from the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty sends something up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court that it's going to be rubber stamped anymore. That's a good thing. But I think we'll get better maps from the federal court because I think ultimately that's what's going to happen. But that's just the short-term solution, and it's costing us a lot of money. I mean, if you thought the $676,000 for the Gableman thing was a waste of taxpayer money, what about the $3 or $4 million we waste every 10 years in legal fees when one party or another or all the parties go into court and haggle over what the map should look like? I mean, that's absurd. That doesn't help a single citizen of Wisconsin if you're not one of those 10 lawyers in court. And so it's been great for the 10 lawyers and not so great for the rest of us. And there's an easy solution to this. And Iowa came up with a solution more than 40 years ago. It's called the Iowa model. They changed the law more than 40 years ago to solve this problem. And it works like this. Rather than the elected officials who happen to have power every 10 years drawing the maps and being able to entrench themselves in power, the people who are going to draw the maps are career civil servants. It's something like our Legislative Reference Bureau, who are sworn to be nonpartisan. And if you're cynical about that, there's another check, because the law says there are these specific criteria in the law that forbid those career civil servants from drawing maps that are intended to help one political party or another, or one elected official or candidate or another. It's worked great in Iowa for more than 40 years. It can work great here in Wisconsin. They didn't put a patent on their model. We can steal that model. And so there is legislation pending right now to steal that model. And I want you to write your legislators about these 2 bills. One bill was introduced by, again, Jeff Smith. He's not in the Assembly anymore. He took some time off from the legislature and then got elected to the Senate. It's Senate Bill 389. Actually, I just saw a Facebook posting from Senator Jeff Smith with a bunch of squashes. And on the squashes, he wrote gerrymandering, squash gerrymandering. Really clever. SB 389 is Senate Bill 389, introduced by Jeff Smith. And the companion bill, the identical bill in the Assembly, is AB for Assembly Bill, AB 395. That was introduced by Representative Deb Andraka from the Milwaukee area. And so urge your legislators to vote for these bills and also demand a public hearing for these bills. You know, banning gerrymandering is super popular, as you can tell from this map. Or you can tell from a Marquette Law School poll that came out a couple of years ago that said 72% of Wisconsinites want to ban gerrymandering, and that included 63% of Republicans and 76% of independents. When a huge, vast majority of Wisconsinites want a bill to pass, can we at least have a public hearing on the sucker? Is that too much to ask? So please urge your legislators to demand a public hearing for these bills so anyone here could go testify about why it's important. And yes, bring the thing to a vote. Let's make people accountable. Vote on this bill that the people of Wisconsin want. You know, there's so many things that the people of Wisconsin want and we don't get. Increased Medicaid spending, increased spending for schools, increased spending for special ed, medical marijuana, 83% of Wisconsinites want that. And when we're not getting what we want, when the vast majority of we the people aren't getting what we the people want, you know our democracy is not functioning properly. And that's the case here with banning gerrymandering as well. You know, 100 years ago, Fighting Bob La Follette said the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. And we desperately need more democracy in Wisconsin right now. Banning gerrymandering is one of the steps to get us more democracy in Wisconsin. And we desperately need more democracy across this country. So thank you for being part of the pro-democracy movement in Wisconsin and the pro-democracy movement in this country. We need your help as never before. Thanks so much.
Well, Matt is told us that he's willing to answer questions. So does anyone have a question for him?
I always have a question. Matt, do you have any suggestions as to how we can reach out to voters who have been in a gerrymandered district and may have become discouraged from voting? 2022 midterms are coming at us, and we'll need an outstanding voter turnout. What can we do to target these people?
Well, I think if we've learned anything over the last 10 years here in Wisconsin and across the country, is that voting is really important. You know, it's really important who is governor. It's really important who controls the state assembly. It's really important who controls the state senate, and of course it's really important who's president of the United States. And I think we should just try to make the point in people's personal, you know, do you want more spending for your public schools? Do you want broadband? Do you want special ed spending to increase if you have a member of your family who has special needs? Try to make it specific to that person's life. But I do think it's also important for us to talk not only to the disaffected voters, but to talk to some voters who voted the way you didn't like last time around. And I'm not talking about all of them. I'm not talking about talking to people who are flying Nazi flags and Confederate flags. That would probably not be an effective use of your time. But I happen to know, and I'm sure you know, because you throw a rock in the air and every other person who would hit here in Wisconsin voted for Donald Trump. Half of the people in Wisconsin voted for Trump. Not all those people are evil people. I think we need to come to terms with that fact. Not all those people are irreconcilable racists, irredeemable right-wing nuts. Some of them are, but not all of them are. And I know some. I play cards with some folks who I consider to be friends and decent people who voted for Trump. And I've made it a practice to try to engage them. And I don't know how successful that practice is going to be, but I do think we need to engage people who don't agree with us down the line, but who we know, who are in our lives, who we play cards with or have in our book clubs or exercise with or socialize with or worship with or whatever, and try to engage them. It's just, there's a very disheartening thing that's happened in this country is that we're just in our camps. We're in our two camps. You know, liberals can watch MSNBC or CNN, listen to public radio, read The Nation, call it a day. And if you're living in Madison, if you're living in the Isthmus of Madison as I did, we used to live one block from West High. You know, I could go a week before I'd run into someone who didn't agree with me. You know, and that's possible in Madison. It's not so possible once you get outside of Madison and Milwaukee. And it's unhealthy if we don't encounter other people. It's unhealthy in that we don't exercise our intellectual muscles in encountering ideas that are different than our own, so we figure out how to deal with them. It's unhealthy because we don't have any empathy for the people who believe things that we don't believe, and then we can make ridiculous categorical assertions like all Republicans suck, or anyone who voted for Trump is evil. And it's just bad politics. It's bad politics that we're not convincing anybody. We're just talking to ourselves. And I want to salute a couple Republicans here who are in elective office in Wisconsin, in the legislature. And one is Senator Kathy Bernier from the Eau Claire area. She did an amazing thing the other day. She is the chair of the Senate Committee on Elections. She's the counterpart to Janelle Brandon, and a counterpart in so many ways. She is a former clerk and admires the works that clerks do, county clerks, city clerks. And she knows that elections are fair in Wisconsin. And so what she did was she held a public hearing, not as the chair of the Senate Elections Committee, just in her own personal capacity as a state senator. She held an informational hearing, which was broadcast on Wisconsin Eye. You can go to Wisconsin Eye and look at it, where she had the director of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, a Rock County clerk, and a city clerk from somewhere in southern Wisconsin testify about all the checks and balances there are that make it virtually impossible to steal an election in Wisconsin. And she said at the very end, I just want people to stop misrepresenting what happens in elections in Wisconsin. She was talking, not too much in code, to people like Janelle Brandon and Robin Voss and Michael Gableman. And she didn't have to do that. I'm sure she got a lot of guff for doing it. And I'm sure the base hated her for doing it. But she took a courageous stand. Another courageous Senate Republican is Senator Rob Coles from up in Green Bay. And his most recent courageous vote was in favor of Tommy Thompson's effort to keep our campuses safe and our students and faculty and staff healthy on campus. And so I recoil when people, and sometimes you hear this on liberal talk radio, they make blanket assertions about all Republicans are this, that, or the other thing. And that's a terrible mistake. It's a logical mistake because it can't possibly be true. And it's a horrible political mistake because we need to hold up Republicans who have integrity, like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, and those in Wisconsin who I mentioned. And we need to talk to the people who are talkable to, who didn't vote the way you wanted them to vote last time around. I think that's really important. Otherwise, we're just going to be in our camps just lobbing mud at each other for the rest of time. And that's no way for a democracy to function.
Thank you for an excellent talk, Matt. Two questions for you. The first is the Wisconsin legislature in a position to overturn the vetoes of Governor Evers? And the second question is, are there petitions out there about gerrymandering to add that requirement to the Constitution of the state of Wisconsin?
The legislature doesn't have the votes to override. The Republicans do not have the votes to override. I know it's been Robin Voss's nightly fantasy that he was going to get that, but they don't have those votes. Actually, they lost 2 votes in the state assembly last time around. The place to go is the Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition. Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition has petitions on its website about these bills, for instance. Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition we're a part of it. League of Women Voters is a part of it. The Fair Elections Project's a part of it. Voces de la Frontera is a part. There are a lot of great groups. This is another fantastic thing that's going on in Wisconsin that doesn't get enough coverage. That is the pro-democracy nonprofits, the progressive nonprofits in Wisconsin. We all work together. We're all rowing in the same direction. We meet every week or every 2 weeks. We strategize together. We do media stuff together. The slur on the nonprofit sector for a long time is everybody's in their own silos. They're competing pettily for the same grant money. There are big male ego fights going on all the time. Not true. Not true here in Wisconsin. I've been really impressed over the last 7 years with how everybody cooperates and gets along together. You raise one question, and that is not just about passing these bills, but should we have a constitutional amendment and solve the problem with a constitutional amendment? Because, of course, if you pass a bill like this Jeff Smith, Deb Indraka bill, if Republicans swept everything, they could pass another bill that would wipe that one off the books. And Representative Diane Hesselbein of down in Dane County and maybe up to here, I'm not sure her district lines, introduced a bill in the last session for a constitutional amendment to give us independent, nonpartisan redistricting. And we're in favor of that too. I don't think she's introduced it yet again this time, but that would be another way to solve this problem in a more permanent way. It's a little longer road. It's got to pass in 2 consecutive sessions of the legislature and then goes to a referendum. And it's the only time that a referendum is binding in Wisconsin is when you're amending the Constitution. Some states have binding referendums, like during Act 10. We couldn't have a referendum on Act 10. Ohio had passed a similar bill, and they had a referendum, and they got rid of that bill through referendum. And actually, Michigan solved the problem of gerrymandering through referendum without going to a constitutional amendment. But we don't have the power of referendum yet in this state. It is one of the things I'm calling for in that book that Sue mentioned. It's one chapter of the 12 chapters, How to Save Democracy in Wisconsin. A big chapter is banning gerrymandering too. Another big chapter is money in politics, cleaning up campaign finance reform, overturning Citizens United, saying finally that corporations aren't persons and money isn't speech. So there's a lot more to discuss about saving democracy in Wisconsin than gerrymandering. But of all the things, solving gerrymandering may be one of the easiest. I mean, we're not going to solve racism in Wisconsin that easily, or economic injustice in Wisconsin that easily, or prison gerrymandering either. You know what prison gerrymandering is? People who, for instance, if you're arrested, you live in Milwaukee, you're arrested and convicted of a crime and you're sent to Waupun for 1.5 years, you're counted as living in Waupun for 10 years, not as living in Milwaukee. And so then Waupun gets more resources as a consequence of having more people counted in the census, and Milwaukee gets less. And so there are movements around the country to solve that problem too. So, but yeah, I'm for constitutional amendments here to solve gerrymandering and solve other problems, including giving us the power of referendum.
Couple of questions. What do you think the chances are for adopting the Iowa model?
Well, the Iowa model has, at this point, this legislation has 3 Republican co-sponsors. Todd Novak of Dodgeville, who's the mayor of Dodgeville, who's been in the assembly for a long time, who's been a champion of independent, nonpartisan redistricting, votes for it, co-sponsors it every time it comes up, and it's come up, you know, in the 4 times since I've been there. Travis Tranel is from southwestern Wisconsin. He also is a co-sponsor. And Joel Kitchens from up north, up in Door County, is the 3rd co-sponsor. Last time around, we had 5 co-sponsors. We had Oldenburg, who's also in the southwest, and we had MRSA from up north. They didn't sign on this time. I'm not sure why they didn't sign on. I wish they had. But one Republican in the legislature said he knows of, you know, at least a dozen people who would want to sign on to this, but the speaker doesn't want them to. And the thing is, with the rigged districts and the way campaign finance goes in this state, the speaker has a lot of money at his disposal and can throw that money at anyone who steps out of line and says, I'm going to primary you. I'm going to run someone to the right of you in the primary. I'm going to fund that person to the gills, and you're going to be out of office. So do you want to co-sponsor this bill, or do you want to stay in office? That's how the game's played, unfortunately.
Democrats that have such safe districts that would vote against this, you know, turning it over to an independent panel, because it does work both ways.
It's a pretty united as this is a pro-democracy reform. So I don't know any Democrat who doesn't want to vote for this.
Any Democrat with a safe district that would vote against.
No, because it's part of the vision of the Democratic Party for reforming our process. So, I mean, it may be that there are Democrats in safe districts who will vote against something that the party wants, but it's not on this issue.
Do you know if there's any talk about potentially the government accountability board, potentially bringing that back, and being able to do your campaign financing in that, also the map redistricting, and the election process? Because that would bring like consistently judges. So
we were big fans of the Government Accountability Board, GAB. The Government Accountability Board was destroyed by the Republicans in 2015, at the same time that they horribly rewrote our campaign finance law. And they didn't like the Government Accountability Board because it was independent. It had also had investigative powers, and it had started the investigation, or participated in the investigation of Scott Walker and the John Doe 2 scandal, where it was pretty clear that Scott Walker had apparently violated state statutes that said candidates cannot be coordinating with outside groups in their elections. And what Walker was doing was going all around the country during the recalls, having millionaires and billionaires write six-figure and seven-figure checks, not to the Republican Party of Wisconsin, not to Scott Walker for governor or whoever legislator was running, but to the Wisconsin Club for Growth. And then Wisconsin Club for Growth would then funnel the money to the Republican Party or the legislators. And that was against the law until the Wisconsin Supreme Court in the summer of 2015 invented a novel interpretation of the First Amendment that said that the First Amendment prohibits the state of Wisconsin from banning coordination between candidates and outside issue advocacy groups. It's nothing that the U.S. Supreme Court has ever said, quite the contrary. So what happened with the John Doe 2 prosecutor was that the Wisconsin Supreme Court fired the John Doe 2 prosecutor and ended the John Doe 2 case. The John Doe 2 prosecutor, this is a tangent, but had asked two of the justices on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, including Michael Gableman at the time, and David Prosser was the other one, asked them to recuse themselves from the case because they had benefited to the tune of more than $1 million each of expenditures, ad expenditures by Wisconsin Club for Growth and Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, both of whom were entangled in the John Doe 2 scandal. So it was a corrupt decision. That's why I say Gableman, one of the reasons Gableman's a corrupt justice, for instance. But the Government Accountability Board, I mean, we need that. The weird thing is, so instead of the Government Accountability Board, what they did was they created a Wisconsin Elections Commission and a Wisconsin Ethics Commission. And so right now they're mad at the Wisconsin Elections Commission. The Republicans are mad at the Wisconsin Elections Commission, which is a baby that they birthed. And so that's kind of ridiculous too. We need an independent ethics body and an independent elections body. Right now, there are three hyper-partisan people, Democrats, and three hyper-partisan Republicans on those panels. So sometimes nothing happens, because if there's something that one party really wants and one party doesn't want, they're just going to be stalemated forever.
Yeah, I was encouraged when the Wisconsin Supreme Court, I think earlier this year, turned down a rules petition that Will sponsored that would have laid the ground rules for redistricting case to go through the state courts instead of the federal, like it always does. And they turned down that rule petition with two of the most conservative justices speaking strongly against it because they want to maintain the fiction that our Supreme Court is non-political. How the outcome would appear political no matter what they do with the case. I was surprised then that a few months later they voted 4-3 to take this case from Will as an original matter when they're not equipped to have rules to hear evidence or how to decide it. So what's going on?
Well, it is kind of odd. Given the opportunity by the Wisconsin Law and Liberty, and I think it was by disgraced former Speaker of the House, Speaker of the Assembly, Scott Jensen, to take original jurisdiction of redistricting and decided not to several months ago, as you suggested. Now they're doing it. I don't know what's going on up there. When they decided that in the spring, they said this doesn't mean we won't take it up later, so they gave themselves an out during that ruling, and I don't know what happened with the other justices at this point. But look, the gerrymandering cases that have gone to court in Wisconsin since that landmark one-person, one-vote decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, all have been decided by federal courts. 1980, 1990, 2000, it all was decided by federal courts. So I think it's going to end up there no matter, if the Wisconsin Supreme Court comes down with a bad decision, it's instantly going to be appealed in federal court.
We talked about school funding in Act 55 back in 2015, they started funding private schools at that point, and I think there's $350 million in this last budget just for the private schools. You mentioned about the special education funding for the general fund. Moving that $350 million back over to getting the vouchers and they're getting state funding, so they're kind of double dipping with that activity fund.
Well, one of the scandals over the last many years here in Wisconsin is how much money has been going to the private schools and the school voucher program. And it's not an accident. The American Federation for Children, which is Betsy DeVos's group, has spent millions upon millions of dollars to elect Republican officials here in Wisconsin, and we'll give them some of our tax dollars. That's what's been going on. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you.